welcome to King's Pages, a little show where we talk about some of the wonderful reads we have here for you at King Township Public Library. My name is Daniel Lenz.
And I'm Brent Chittenden.
And today we've got a couple of lovely stories for you about the darker sides of men. A pair of monster stories, Hellboy and the Saga of the Swamp Thing. Now, these are both lovely titles I've enjoyed more than once now. And I thought we'd kick things off with Hellboy. The first trade, the first package that we have there on Hoopla for any of our readers from KTPL is The Seeds of Destruction. Now, I will admit, I came into Hellboy reading the comic after the first movie came out, but I cannot say I was disappointed in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the first book, Seed of Destruction, is very much the basis for the Hellboy movie, because it gives you all the basic beats of the story. And the truth of it is the first book is very much a complete sort of story, because they didn't know they were going to get more than 6 issues at any point. So Mike Mignola and John Byrne, who a lot of people know from his work on X-Men and Superman, John came on as a scripter because Mignola wasn't quite confident in his writing abilities, but apparently 2 issues in, Byrne was like, no, you got this, just do it yourself. But the story is really good for what it is, an occulty World War II-ish story with Hellboy fighting Nazis and evil Russians and monsters that are like Cthulhu-like and all that sort of stuff. Mignola really decided if he was going to do it, he was going to try at least get a bunch of stuff that he liked and wanted to draw in this book. That way, if it didn't end up going any further, he could at least say that he gave it his best shot.
It is a wonderful story. As you said, it as a single tome really is a contained story on itself. It introduces everything. It leaves just enough hanging that there's places for it to go in other stories later, but if you never read another, you won't feel like you're missing anything, really.
It's also a really good introduction to Mignola's art style. It's one of those things that it's very much his art style. You can see it a mile away in whatever project he's working on.
Oh, yes.
And if it's something you don't really dig into, now is your point to turn away. But if it's something you like, you just start to notice how his mind works. And I believe Guillermo del Toro, who directed the movie, said one of the issues with directing the movie to make it look like the comic was you couldn't do it because Mike has a tendency to use shadow where shadow can't exist and light where light can't exist. So you can't really do that in like a live action film. But
no, Mignola's style is very stylized, stark lights and darks. Even in a story that's meant to be dark in tone to begin with, it's a wonderful paranormal noir action story. And the artwork really carries that tone delightfully in the Hellboy comic. And while they might not have been able to carry that sort of that artistic feel into the live action film, there's no way you could have and done it justice. It's the sort of thing that exists in the printed page in a way that can only be done right through that medium. And one of the things that's delightful to find in so many comics out there is not just well done art, but art that doesn't just depict the story as it's going, but the style and the work put into it really evokes and brings out elements of the story and characters in a way that you couldn't get in any other fashion. And Mike Mignola's art style is one of the best and clearest examples of that.
The other thing I like is, weirdly, throughout the series, Hellboy is the everyman. He is a demon guy, but he likes to drink and he likes to have fun, but this is his day job, is dealing with monsters. And I believe at least sort of like how the personality of Hellboy is actually based off of Mignola's dad, who is like a factory worker or something along those lines. And that's why he did it, is he wanted everybody to be able to relate to the main character, despite the fact that like he might be the coming of the apocalypse, or he might be the thing that just beats up monsters all the time.
But at the same time, that tension with the character, where he has been born and raised and lived in such a way that he is this everyman to the core, but can't escape the fact that to everyone around him, to the world around him, he appears and is a monster. That tension of monster and humanity is something that you don't see a lot of in the first trade with Seeds of Destruction, but they do more with as the series goes on, and really comes out in the films as well. And that tension between humanity and monster is something that has been brought forward in literature for ages and has always, when done properly, really brought richness to stories and characters, and in a lot of ways is the most uniting facet between the two titles we're talking about today, between Hellboy and Swamp Thing, that tension between man and monster.
I can't gush enough about it. It's one of the like I love just pretty much every facet of it, and it's a story that evolves, and the characters in it, like the ones that stick around, evolve too. Like Hellboy does change from the first story to the last story, and that's I love reading that progression, and it doesn't seem forced. It seems fairly natural.
No, and that's very true. I will say I've known you for quite some time, Brent, and I've heard you gush about a number of things comic related, but Hellboy is definitely one of the ones that's come up more than once. And Alan Moore actually is one of the ones I've heard you talk about quite a bit over the years.
Yeah, because as a writer, Alan Moore is one of those dudes who just every time I read his stuff, I learn something. And Swamp Thing, his run on Swamp Thing, is a prime example of how Alan managed to change comics like three separate times over his comic book career. Like he has had three instances where he did something and everything changed. And the first one really is his work on Swamp Thing.
Now, our listeners might remember our first episode, we were talking about The Watchmen, which was also a seminal work by Alan Moore. But The Swamp Thing, as you say, Brent, was one of his first big titles there that he worked on. And the saga of The Swamp Thing is an interesting run in the trades, because the first trade paperback from Alan Moore actually starts with issue number 20 in the series, but in a lot of ways is a new beginning to the character without being the kind of official reboot you see happening all the time in comics since then. He took the first issue of this trade paperback to wrap up a lot of storylines that had been left open from the previous writer that he was taking over from, and you can feel that coming into it. That first issue in the trade paperback can be a little bit strange to get through at first, because it's wrapping up some storylines and setting in motion a couple of other things for later on. But once you get into the second issue of that trade paperback, especially The Anatomy, then Alan is really taking the story for his own and really, really brings out this delightful, subtle horror element building just through that entire issue of the issue called The Anatomy, as you start getting a peek under the hood of what Alan has planned for you.
Yeah, the Anatomy Lesson is a comic that if you read any book about how to write comics, it's usually one of the first ones mentioned, just because it was at the time this came out, and we're talking like early 1980s. There wasn't anything really like it around. Definitely not in mainstream comics. Basically, Alan takes a great tact at changing the character in the book from what it was to something a bit different, to where he wanted to write stories, but not negating anything that had come before it, which is usually in comics it's the opposite. Is new writer, new artist takes over, and if they want, they just chuck everything out that they didn't like.
They
Whereas
have their own
more,
ideas and they start
yeah,
from scratch and try to erase or sweep under the rug a lot of things. But you're right, Alan Moore with his run on Swamp Thing, he doesn't negate anything. Even the way he wraps up things in that first bit of the trade really is just building on what's there and taking it in a different direction, but always building on the foundation of what he's been handed, which is a sort of respect that doesn't get carried a lot in the industry when things get handed over from one to another. And it's not necessarily a lack of respect when an artist or a writer takes over and kind of ignores things. It's just the way things are kind of done.
yeah.
But
And
the way that Alan builds on what he has brings far more richness to the story and the character.
And if you go through his run, like you see it building and stuff in this first volume, but if you continue to follow it, the stuff that Moore created in Swamp Thing that's still kicking around. John Constantine is a prime example. Like if you read about it, that character more or less came about from an offhand comment that one of the artists made, that he wanted to draw a character that looked like Sting, the musician from the bass player of the Police. And then he did that, and then they built it. And Constantine's still around. He's had a TV show. He's been a part of the Legends of Tomorrow TV show.
He had a
A couple
movie, if you
animated
want to
films.
look
He
at
had
that.
yeah,
He's all over the place.
yeah, and
In fact,
various comic
probably
book
the
incarnations.
easiest place for some of our listeners to find him these days would be in the Legends of Tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. So it's stuff like that. Like, weirdly, one of the biggest legacies that comes out of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing is another writer, because Neil Gaiman had sort of given up on comics, and then he had always liked Swamp Thing as a character, and he was stuck at a train station or something and picked up an issue of Moore's run and absolutely fell in love with it and began following it. A couple of years later, he meets and becomes friends with Alan Moore and asks him it's either a convention or a pub, of like, how do you write a comic book? And Moore shows him one of his scripts for Swamp Thing, and from there, Neil starts working in comics and is now the creative juggernaut that we know Neil Gaiman to be. So it's like that. You can't really understate how important this series was. And for my money, I love Watchmen. And in our previous episode where we talked about it, is you can honestly see it, but I don't think Swamp Thing gets as much love as it deserves, because Swamp Thing for Alan is one of the few runs where he really got to go for a while with it. Like, he was on that book for numerous issues. Like it fills up I want to say 4 trades and 4 story collections that are all in the Hoopla app right now. That's a good run. That's not just like 12 issues.
No,
And
that is a
yeah, there is some
substantial run.
Yeah.
But I think you hit on something there too, though, where the Saga of the Swamp Thing and Alan Moore's run on it has had such a vast effect on the world of comics, and which has also bled into other media. I can't count on 2 hands the number of TV shows and movies that have come from directly or been inspired by the works of Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman alone.
Yeah.
But the Swamp Thing is often forgotten, I think, because so much of what has come from it has been subtle, behind the scenes. It's not in the headlines a lot of the time. For all the people that know of Neil Gaiman and his works, that have introduced their children to Coraline, they likely don't know about his inspiration from Alan Moore. And that sort of thing can be a delight to learn about, but it's the sort of thing that has led to Swamp Thing being as underappreciated as it has been.
And it also should be noted, like the covers and the art by the various guys who worked on this, especially it at one point it ended up being the regular team for a long stretch of Alan Moore and then Steve Bissette and Rick Veitch basically Steve and Rick Veitch worked sort of together. And Rick actually is the guy who worked on the book enough and understood the characters enough that after Alan left, Rick took over Swamp Thing for a good story run as well. So he learned at kind of the feet of the master in a lot of ways. But definitely take a look at Saga of the Swamp Thing book 1. If for nothing else, read the anatomy lesson issue, because it's just, if you've ever thought about writing horror or a comic book, or just appreciate the skill that can go into either of those things, it's worth looking at what he does with what he had.
And the artwork throughout that whole thing, in some ways, a lot of people's first impression might be that it's old, and that's what comics used to look like. And at first glance, yes, it is, but it's such a well done example of what they could do with printing presses at that time in mass production for comics. It's still wonderfully done, every frame. Oh, can't recommend it enough. Saga of the Swamp Thing by Alan Moore, or Hellboy, Mike Mignola. Check them both out. They're available now through Hoopla, through King Township Public Library. If you're not in King Township, then by all means check out your own local library. They likely have these same titles or many others available to you. Thank you once again for coming by and listening to this. This is Daniel Enns.
And Brent Chittenden.
And thanks once again for listening, and thank you for all the fish.
Thank you for listening to King's Pages. Theme music provided by purpleplanet.com.